Good day and welcome to Glasnost in our time, where we try to look at the world rationally in the hope that it will rationally look back. I'm your host, Anthony D'Agostino. It's June 27th, 2024. The wars in Ukraine and Gaza are both escalating. Ukraine is losing ground gradually, but attacking Russia with missiles, drones, and terror attacks. Israel has not destroyed Hamas, but may be ready to attack Lebanon. Hezbollah threatens to attack targets in Israel as Ukraine has been attacking targets in Russia. Israel seems ready to fight, even if that means its cities will be hit. Russia is promising to respond. We have to ask the question, will the U.S. be drawn into war against Iran, against Russia, or both? Can the rush toward World War III be stopped? Can the powers seek their aims by political means instead? Has everyone given in to the general despair of war? Let's pretend that there's going to be a tomorrow and talk about some political and cultural questions. Today we have Mitch Jeserich, host of KPFA's Letters and Politics, to talk with us about the changing role of media in forming world historical consciousness. So welcome to Glasnost, Mitch.
Great to be here, Professor.
So I've heard that KPFA has the strongest FM signal west of Chicago, and there's a string of very highbrow shows on KPFA, including Doug Henwood, Behind the News, Ian Masters, Background Briefing, C.S. Sung, Against the Grain, and others. And your show, Letters and Politics, it must be as intellectually ambitious as anything on radio, including public radio. It's a kind of a university of the air in a sense. Are you talking to the same audience as public radio? It's certainly not the same audience as AM radio. How would you imagine your listeners? What profile would they make up in society?
Well, it's a difficult question because obviously I do hear from some listeners. I do know some listeners, but the nature of radio means that you actually don't know exactly who is listening. It just is broadcasted out over the airwaves to whoever is interested, or even maybe not interested, but perhaps forgot to change the dial and is not in a position near the radio where they could do it. I've been in that kind of situation. So, first, it is a little bit of a difficult question because you don't always know exactly who your listeners are. Now, there are services out there that do polling that oftentimes will inform, like, rating systems. But my radio station, KPFA, doesn't pay for those things. We actually, and those things are usually garnered towards and geared towards advertisements. And as you know, KPFA is a radio station that does not play ads, does not accept commercials to help fund the radio station and to provide the research for the radio station. We rely on our listeners instead. But we do have a sense. I mean, I don't want to be misleading. We do have a sense of who a good number of our listeners are. And to the beginning of your question, do we share listeners with NPR? We do share a lot of listeners with NPR. There is a lot of crossover, and what little data we do have does suggest that people who listen to KPFA also will listen to KQED and vice versa, even though we don't quite have the listenership that KQED does. In fact, KQED is the most listened to radio station in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is interesting. For many years, it was KGO on the news dial, but regrettably, the corporate powers that control that radio station let it go basically into oblivion, which is unfortunate. So, but who are our listeners? I think our listeners are progressives, obviously. Our listeners are people who object to the mainstream, including the liberal mainstream. Our listeners are, while we do share, and there's a lot of crossover with NPR, there's also our listeners also tend to, I think, have a little more distrust of NPR and think that NPR is a little too mainstream for it and want an alternative to it. Our listeners, I think, are older, as is the nature of radio today. There's an important question as to who even
That is
owns
the
it.
nature of radio, you think, that it's for
Yeah. Oh,
older?
yeah. Yeah. It's the old medium. I almost hate to say it, but there's a bit of romanticism to it. In a way, Professor, I think we are going the way of the scribes. There are just less and less people who own radios these days. We've been, like many other media forms, have been replaced by the internet, and are being replaced by the internet and podcasts. And you can find our radio station on the internet, and you can find our programs and podcast. But the vast majority of listeners, people who still actually listen to the terrestrial radio, are older. Now, not exclusively. There's a young woman who lives in my building, who I was talking to the other day, and she informed me she listens to KPFA and she has a radio. And she even had some of our thank you gifts to prove that she was a listener. And but it was so rare. I was kind of shocked. I was like, "Are you serious?" um, that this younger woman had a radio and listened to KPFA. But by and large, most people are listening to things on their phones or even in their cars these days.
I
A
was going
lot
to
of
say, I mean, everybody's got a car radio, and that's the easiest way to.
So I don't drive, so I'm speaking a little bit out of my lane, no pun intended. But many cars these days also come with internet capability.
Mm.
And at the very least, a lot of people just connect their phones to the sound system in their car. So radio is still listened to a great deal in the car. It's probably, and as for many years now, been our sort of our last bastion. But even that is changing. And so, it just gets back to the point. I think our listeners trend to be older, because I think radio listeners in general are older because they have a long tradition of listening to radio.
A lot of people are kind of alarmed. There's a certain discourse about the new media to the effect that we're losing our sense of truth, that anybody can say anything, um, in fact, people are making up their own truth and all the rest of that. Everything's unreliable. We have to ask what we can have faith in. And I guess the imagery people have in their minds is the Walter Cronkite, the network news of the 1960s and 70s, and they sort of don't like this new media. You see editorials on this in the news sometimes, in the mainstream papers, that there's some kind of menace to and it's a sort of an epistemological question. It's our idea of knowledge, our notion of truth. How do you feel about all that?
I mean, there's some truth to it. Like everything, there's good and bad to what the internet has done to media and how media has transformed itself. I do think one of the problems that we are facing is that now there are just so many different options, that we have lost a shared source of knowledge. We have lost that. We are all getting sort of the same facts, and now we are able to make and a place that, at least on the surface, looks to try to give both sides to a story. And so I guess what I mean, and it's not just the internet, it's also cable news, right? It's Fox News, it's MSNBC, and even CNN, which I don't think tracks left or right, but, really tracks pro-establishment, I think that you find at CNN. And and I and then those are just the obvious examples in cable news, but you even get it more extreme, I think, when it comes to what you find on the internet. And what ends up happening is what we call confirmation bias. You're basically listening to outlets that are already confirming and have already confirmed your worldview. And so I think in that sense, it really is a problem. Matt Taibbi, a journalist, um, wrote the book Hate Inc. And is his thesis in his book, the argument that he makes is that the news media now is driving us to hate each other. And I think that's actually true. Now, Matt Taibbi also participates in sort of the public poking of people. I don't think he's as innocent as he may think he is in writing a book, but I think his thesis is actually spot on. I think when you look at the division in the country today and just the sort of when we see each other as existential threats to the republic, I actually do think it is media driven, including from Donald Trump, but not just Donald Trump. I think is what is the larger point I'm trying to say here. I think we do have a media that we all participate in, including myself, including my radio station, that we are driving each other to distrust and dislike each other. And I do think that is a problem. However, when we talk about the old media, which I work for, a radio station, and and think about the good old days, I think you, Professor, as an expert on the Cold War, know this better than anyone. What we had in the past is just a few news outlets, ABC, NBC, CBS, New York Times, Washington Post, and they controlled the narrative. And it was they would give you, maybe two sides to a story, but that was it, as though there only were two sides. And they gave you a very narrow narrative to every story. This is why I think KPFA was wildly important back in sort of the 1960s when we had a radio program by Bill Mandel, in which he went through the Soviet press. I think it was called Soviet periodicals or something like that, letting you know what the Soviet press was saying at the time. That wound him up in having to testify to the HUAC committee when it came to San Francisco, and had the hearings. And I think it was like 1960, but I might be off on a year or two there. And so, KPFA was wildly important then, because that was what because you didn't get that kind of perspective. So I do think today's media has created 1,000, if not more, demagogues, which I think is dangerous in its own way. There's a demagogue almost everywhere you can find on the internet now. At the same time, I do think it's also important to be careful about thinking about this great day of news media of the past, when it was also incredibly limited. And I guess I'll give a couple of recent examples that I don't think would have been possible in previous eras. It is through the internet, and not just through news media, but through social media, where you get the flowering, I think, of Occupy Wall Street, where I think you get the blooming of Black Lives Matter, and also of, say, the hashtag Me Too movement. Now, all of these movements are not perfect. With any movement, there are excesses that happen, right? But I don't think any of these movements happen when we just have the news controlled by a very small select group of people. So, it's good. I think it's good, and it's bad. But the bad is also dangerous. I think what we have right now, what does give us these special movements, also makes demagoguery possible, and makes it easier, I think, for us to sort of learn and to fall in these traps of information that drive us apart rather than together.
There's been a lot said about this, how the internet is an organizer. It can be used as an organizer. And I think it was Paul Mason wrote a book about this a few years ago, judging from how Tahrir Square was put together, and the use of the internet in order to rally people and all the rest of that. So to be sure, the internet maybe serves the role of a weekly paper or a daily paper in 1900, say, in the early days of social movements. Um, it can be a kind of an agitator. It can be used for agitation. Your work, though, and some of the things I've mentioned, and I would guess, I would say most of what KPFA does doesn't fall under the category of agitation. It's much more contemplative. It's more, what's the word? Highbrow. Very, very highbrow stuff, which, by the way, which I think is terrific. One of the things I love the most about KPFA, I think it's a lot more highbrow than almost any other media. Almost anything else, certainly almost anything you run into on radio. So in a way, that's a kind of an interesting function that is being performed. Maybe it could be that in an era when the internet can be used strictly for agitation, it can also be used for this, what's the point, highbrow discourse. And, one of the things about the old media, back in the days when Huntley Brinkley gave you 15 minutes of news, and Walter Cronkite, 15 minutes. When they went to half hour, I remember it was an expansion, and they almost didn't know what to say within the enormous expanse of half an hour. There was this very limited, coverage on the television, and people read the New York Times and the Washington Post and Foreign Affairs, maybe a handful of other periodicals. If you read all that stuff, you had a very concentrated idea of the policy decisions that were being made at the highest level. So in a certain sense, it was a very sophisticated, concentrated debate. And now I don't think you see that at all. The debate at that level is very diffuse. And I mean, you don't know exactly, who's saying something authoritative and who's just saying something. So in a way, it's the new media presents us with a lot of new challenges, things we haven't contemplated before.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this, like I said at the beginning, it's good and there are good things and bad things about it. And will we collectively, I mean, that's a big question, right? Will we collectively be able to make sense of it? I don't know. I don't know what the future holds.
One of the things
we respond to this.
One of the best things I think about shows like yours, Mitch, is that you keep an eye on the college press, on the university presses. These are very threadbare, small outfits, University of Kentucky Press, University of Illinois Press, but they are publishing very interesting stuff. And it's for the highbrow media such as yours, and for the audience that drinks that in. I see it as sort of the intelligentsia generally, that's all of educated society. And yeah, a lot of educated people in the United States, for them, I think that's just great. You keep everybody up with, monograph literature, and I think that is just fantastic. How do you keep up with it, and how do you decide what to review?
Well, it's funny I keep sort of chuckling to myself when you call it highbrow. Not, but I'm not offended by that. But
that's a high compliment, by the way.
And I know that's how you mean it. Yeah, and I know that's how you mean it. But I do chuckle to myself because, I'm a kid from, my mom was a school bus driver and my stepdad was a truck driver. I was the first kid to go to college in my family. Oftentimes, as you, I remember one of the early years when I first started as a reporter on KPFA, because that's how I got involved, was being a volunteer reporter. I went to air and I saw the word epitome and I said epitome. and I had to be told afterward, no, that's epitome. That wasn't the only mistake I made then, and I still make plenty of verbal mistakes today, or what are at least seen as verbal mistakes, because I do not come from an educated background. I come from a very blue collar, sort of lower middle class background, and in a small town at the outskirts of the Bay Area, which was much more like the rest of the country than, say, San Francisco, Oakland, or Berkeley, right here in the Bay Area. So, um, but I do have, and I didn't always have, but I do have. I barely graduated high school, even. And I know you're not asking for my own personal story here, so forgive me. But I'm just sort of explaining a little bit why the whole highbrow thing makes me chuckle. I barely graduated high school, not because I didn't have the capacity, because it's not that difficult to get through public education, but because I just wasn't interested in school at the time. And it was, thank God bless, junior colleges, or community colleges, I guess we call them now, where it's where my passion for learning was sparked, because I had some great teachers at Diablo Valley College, better than any other place. Even though and then I went to San Francisco State SF State University, so I'm an alum of your school. We're both related in that way at SFSU, where it was also great. And this is really where my passion for learning came from. And but I never went on to get a bigger degree. I don't have a graduate degree. I studied psychology in school, and I got turned off by the field because I thought everything had a diagnosis to it, and just something that didn't feel right to me about that. And so I wasn't interested in pursuing further education. So my education is basically one of an autodidact, which I even feel uncomfortable calling myself that, but I guess technically it would fit, because I still have, and still continue to have, a passion for learning. As you know, the more you learn, the more you forget. And I don't have any special capacity of remembering the things I have learned. I go back and I listen to old shows, and sometimes we re-air old shows, because I think it's worth, especially if it's historically related, to go back and hear them again. And oftentimes I'll hear myself say something on the air, and I will tell myself, "Oh, I didn't know that," even though I said it, right? Um, and so how do I get asked a question because we talk to lots of authors, and what I'm very good at doing is faking it. And what I mean by that is exactly as it sounds. And furthermore, what I mean by that is when I give off this impression that I must read a book per interview, uh, which I don't. I can't. I don't have any special capacity I'm not a speed reader, or any of the, and I don't read just all the time, Um, but I do prepare for each interview, and I do take time, and I do spend a little time with material, and I also look at I mean, I do take each interview seriously, and I am interested in the subject at hand. And sometimes I maybe have a little bit of background info that I already knew, and then I'm trying to find out what they're talking about, what this is about. But really, it's more about just asking a question that allows the guest to share their knowledge and their information. And I always say asking the question is far more easier than answering them. And that's what I do on this. So I have a curiosity, and and I use that curiosity, and I think in an enthusiastic way. I've always felt, and I think you'll know this, the best teachers are the ones who are enthusiastic about their topic. And the skill of teaching is important, methods important, but number one, are they enthusiastic themselves about it? And if they are, it's infectious. And I try to approach each interview with an enthusiasm towards it, because whenever you talk to anyone, if they're just really interested and enthusiastic to hear what you say, it will open you up. You're like, oh, you like
Sure.
that? Well, here, let me tell you some more.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Your show is much more interested in history, for example. I think, than the other highbrow shows. you know, in fact, you had a series a few years ago. You're not doing it so much nowadays, but a few years ago, you had a series on ancient history, and you had a lot of Oxford dons and various people on, and talking about this monograph literature, basically, that had to do with the ancient world. Now, what was it about the ancient world that got you interested in that?
I think at first, when I first started learning about the fall of Rome as a republic, I don't mean like fall of the Roman Empire. I mean the fall of the Roman Republic that happened first or before, because Rome had a republic, had a government system, had a republic in which you had different, positions with different function. Power was dispersed out to, to particular, positions and these kind of things. And I learned about how there's this 100-year civil war that precedes the fall of Rome. And the one thing that you saw in that is that each side sort of escalated the tension as it went along, and sort of made and pushed the envelope each time. It didn't fall overnight. But one side would do something that sort of pushed the envelope into a new area, which before was seen sort of impossible, and not a part of normal way of political life. And then the other side would respond and do that too.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
basically, I feel like, oh, that's kind of what we're doing here right now in our own republic. And so I started to see parallels in history to what we're living through now. And that's not to say, history repeats itself. I would never make that claim. But I think by studying and observing history, what we do see are patterns. What we do see are pitfalls. What we do see are, well, here's how people reacted to sort of similar circumstances in the past. Oddly, we seem to be behaving that way again. Well, we're the same species, right? So,
Hmm.
in a way,
Hmm.
it makes sense. It doesn't mean we're going to repeat it the exact way, and we never do. It's never repeated in the same way. But you see, but I do think that history provides lessons for what we're going through now. And I saw that with sort of when I first started studying the fall of Rome, but maybe even more. What really put me on history, actually, and I always remember this interview. It was during the Occupy Wall Street days, and we were covering it. I was covering closely what was happening here locally in the Bay Area, in Oakland, Berkeley, and San Francisco. And suddenly I heard about this thing called, in the early 1930s, the Bonus Army. And the Bonus Army were World War I veterans who marched on Washington, D.C., and set up their own tent cities. These were World War I veterans who were down the road later on promised a pension for their service in the war, but because of the Great Depression, they needed that pension now because they were extremely struggling. So these World War I veterans would go, and they created a tent city, a huge tent city in Washington, D.C. And it just reminded me of, oh, this isn't the first time we've had encampments to protest. This is, when Occupy Wall Street first happened, it felt so sort of un-American, not un-American. I don't mean un-American in a negative way, right? But I mean, it just seemed out of the ordinary of what we're used to in American life. But then when you looked a little bit farther, like, oh, wait, no, this is actually quite American. We've done this before. And so I did an interview with Paul Dixon, who actually writes a lot about baseball. He wrote a book about the Bonus Army. And I found that book and I interviewed him about that book. And that show was a hit because people were like, whoa, wait, this has happened before? People had forgot about the Bonus Army.
Hmm.
And then when you see the relations, well, why did Occupy Wall Street happen? There was a financial crisis. People were experiencing their own financial debt. and they saw this great expansion between inequality, wealth inequality. Well, this is what happened in 1929 after the crash, or through the 20s with the roaring 20s, and then the crash of 29, and then the economic downturn that happened, and the desperation people were experiencing in the 30s. And then I saw, oh, well, you know what? It's probably also important to know about what's this New Deal thing that they're talking about here. Whoa, wait, oh, we should know about that. This is important. We have, again, this is all very, up before I think Occupy Wall Street, we weren't talking about the New Deal. And I'm not saying some people were, right? Don't get me wrong, but most people didn't know about the New Deal. This is way before anyone ever thought about a Green New Deal. And
Yeah.
and so I thought that was, and so we did a bunch of shows. You talk about we've done series. We did a huge amount of shows about the New Deal, because again, to me, it was important to be like, oh, before I think, oh, well, we're a country of Reagan and Bush and laissez-faire capitalism, economics, and these things. Like, oh wait, no, no, we have another tradition that's also ours. It's not foreign. It's not outside from here. It's something that is very much within our own tradition and is very American. And I found it was important to talk about those issues and find the appropriate people like yourself, who've been on my show a number of times, to talk about these things.
Yeah, it's really fantastic for the listener of a radio show to have a host going through a process of inquiry, answering his own questions, and I think that's just great. And I think it really works beautifully in media. So you were really interested in a lot of U.S. history. And you still have plenty of shows all the time that deal with U.S. history. Your attitude toward U.S. history must have changed a lot from your earliest impressions, and I bet a lot of the audience went through the same kind of process with you.
You mean sort of like when we're
And
talking about
the earliest impression. How like about Reconstruction, for example.
Yeah.
I studied Reconstruction, and it was described as a very unfortunate time
Yeah.
when, federal troops were in the South. There was a lot of chaos. Everything was really just a big mess. And there was a lot of ill feeling, but it all got settled, and all to the good, of course, in 1877 when they took the federal troops out of the South, and there finally began to be a reconciliation between North and South. And, Reconstruction was an unfortunate episode. That's pretty much the way I studied the matter when I was a grad student. And I only found out later about all of the, really explosive, revolutionary, progressive, whatever you want to call them, aspects of Reconstruction. And, got a little bit more familiar with the literature on it, Philip Foner and other people who wrote about it. You must have had the same kind of thing, having, early impressions about the past of the U.S. And changing your mind about a lot of things as you interviewed these people who produce these lovely scholarly monographs. Books that hardly do any sales. They do sales in the hundreds or thousands. Not much sales. They're mostly designed to go onto the library shelf for the undergraduate to poke around and see at some point. But you bring them to a larger audience, and so that must have changed your own views of the matter.
I mean, Reconstruction's so important. And of course, W.B. Du Bois, I think in the 1930s, writes Black Reconstruction, which sort of has become now the dominant narrative of Reconstruction, but wasn't for many, many years.
Yeah, it's become dominant.
Yeah, which is good. And I think a lot of that had to do with like the 1619 project and yeah, it's important. But I got really interested in the Civil War era, right after Donald Trump got sworn into office as president. And the reason being is I am one of those who did not expect Donald Trump to win the presidency in 2016. In fact, I'll always remember at the time I was also working not just on my show, but our morning program up front because the regular host was doing a scholarly work in Stanford, Brian Edwards Tiekert, and I was filling in for him while he was gone. And it was during the election. And I remember, KBFA, we're not incredibly fond of Hillary Clinton. And I remember telling our team, because I was the producer, look, folks, we're going to have 4 years to trash Hillary Clinton. But tomorrow we got to recognize we're going to have our first woman president. Okay. We got to at least, we want to be conscious of that and,
Yeah.
not just act like it doesn't matter because it does matter. And we need to be aware of that. Right. That's what I said the day of the election. Right. And then I remember being home and just being in shock when Donald Trump
Yeah.
won. I had no premonition that Donald Trump, others have, and to their credit, give credit where credit's due. I was one of those who just thought there was no way Donald Trump was going to win uh, the presidency. So he does, and I didn't get it. I didn't, I didn't, I was, and I still struggle. Like I used to think I had a firm grip of politics. I used to be a Capitol Hill reporter for many years. So I was I knew DC politics very well. And I felt like I had lost my grip of really understanding the political scene. And so I went back to Washington, D.C. with the inauguration of Donald Trump because I wanted to be there for the first few weeks, first couple months, to see if I can get a grip of what's going on. And as soon as I land and I see the look on everyone's face, it was clear to me no one knew. No one knew what was going on. Everyone looked like, what the hell is happening? And I can't say I got like a firm grip of the politics of the day during my time when I went back to DC. However, I did have a fortuitous meeting with the official Senate historian, Betty Coed, really wonderful person who was willing to meet me and had me come to her office to chat and talk. And I remember going in a meeting, and she's very friendly, so I was feeling very friendly back. And I remember looking at her right from the beginning and saying, is there any time in history that is as crazy as this moment right now? And she just laughs at me. She's like, of course, the 1850s, the decade before the Civil War. And I was like, oh, yeah. What was that like? Well, they used to have duels out on the Capitol ground with guns, you know? They just shoot, That's how they dealt with things there. Oh, yeah, there was a guerrilla warfare in Kansas known as Bleeding Kansas
In Kansas.
between abolitionist and pro-slavery
Yeah.
forces. And I was like, what? And so that was another series we did on our program. We did a number of programs about the 1850s. And this was, again, eye-opening to me. I never thought of I mean, I knew of the Civil War in 1861, but I never knew. We all know about well, I say we all, frequently we're given opportunities to learn about the Civil War as a military history, as a brother against brother kind of dynamic. Obviously, there is the important angle of slavery when it comes to the Civil War, but rarely are we ever taught and talk about the political history of the Civil War. Most people, and I think this is changing, but most people don't even realize that the Republican Party was born to fight the slave power of the South. That's where it came from. A lot of people didn't know about, and I think a lot of people still don't know about the radical Republicans in Congress, Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, and and this was a very important moment. It was a very divisive moment that I thought it was important to dive into. What happened what was going on in the decade before the Civil War? So that launched, and then the Civil War obviously was important, and then afterwards Reconstruction was vitally important. What you talked about there. So yeah, the election. Whenever something happens, I guess whenever something, we used to say, Professor, and you know this, as Americans, we learn geography whenever we're involved in a new war, right? We learned about where Iraq was, where Iran was, where Afghanistan was. That's how Americans learn geography. Well, I tend to also learn history about whatever our current crisis is, what's happening in our moment, because I end up trying to find what's something that has echoes from the past of what's happening right now. And then I try to find that, and then I try to explore it and really dive into what happened, not to try to tell people what to think today, because I don't even know what to think today. I don't even have a firm grasp on how people should feel about things, but to give them, and this is what we try to do on our story, we want to give them the story. Here's what happened. Here's who we, within a 50-minute period of time, who we think is worth talking about and what happened of this story. And then let it inform people however it informs them, however they're experiencing their own world in real time.
Absolutely. Yeah, before we go, I have to ask you a political question that has to do with some of the media figures that we're running into nowadays. Let's see what you think about it. Some of them are people that seem to be on the left. Jimmy Dore, for example, or Colonel McGregor is conducting this very sharp critique, military terms. He sounds very, very authoritative. He's got a lot of viewers. He's very powerful. There are a number of people like that. They appear to be criticizing the status quo. So you might think they're leftists, but I don't know about that. And I think maybe they're making an argument for saying that Trump is maybe the answer, that there's some kind of an answer from the right rather than an answer from the left. And some people on the left, you often hear them say things like, I was just involved in this discussion last week, where I heard somebody say, a left person basically say that, well, the right is the only game in town. And I said, what? My goodness. Yeah, do you have some kind of way of conceptualizing these things? Very often you hear the right is speaking very much like the left in media, and especially with Trump on the scene, it's very perplexing. Do you have a thought about that?
Well, they find common ground. I guess I'll call far right and far left because of a lack of better term, but I don't mean that to indicate my feelings towards either. But just to say, I think there is common ground when it comes to the establishment. They're anti-establishment. And there are people on the left who see Donald Trump as anti-establishment. That's debatable. Trump also comes from the establishment. I think he perfectly fits the idea of a demagogue, in the sense where a demagogue does come from the privileged class and then rails and sparks the anger of and taps in even to the anger that is there at large, and then uses that against the others in their own class in order to gain power. I mean, that's typical. That's playbook demagoguery for you. And so, and this is a touchy issue for us because we have listeners who also feel this way. Jimmy Dore comes from Pacifica Radio. his show before it became this internet sensation was being produced out of KPFK in Los Angeles. And so, we find that even on my radio station now.
I may be the only person who says this about Jimmy Dore, but I'm sure somebody else must say it.
Say what?
Well, you know that he's so concentrated about being against Biden that he leaves the door open for saying that Trump is the answer.
Yeah. And he's not alone, but he is a strong voice. I mean, his show is interesting. I used to watch a lot of his show because I knew a lot of our listeners were watching his show, and I wanted to know about his show. And first, just as a fellow broadcaster, I respect somebody who can actually garner an audience, which he has done. And he puts on a good show. It's actually entertaining. He's a comedian. And it's funny. It's sort of he's a meaner Jon Stewart on the hard left.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And he's good at it. He's
The
good
idea
at
of a comedy show that's all political commentary.
yeah.
That's
He's good at it. I do think he also I do think he also dabbles in demagoguery himself, though. And I do think he spurs people to be really angry at other people, which I don't think he would deny. He would say, yeah, it's the establishment. We should be angry. We should be mad as hell, right? But I thought, like, when he was spurring people to go after Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I thought it was overdoing it. I thought, it was overdoing it. He obviously didn't. To him, he's like, I'm keeping their feet to the fire, right? So I can understand where they're coming from, but I also do think, Donald Trump, he's perplexing, right? And he's perplexing for me because on one hand, he's a clown, right? He's a joke. He's the Joker. Salman Rushdie wrote a novel right after the election in which one of the main characters was the Joker, and he basically based the Joker off of Donald Trump, right? But Donald Trump was like, if that fictional character, the Joker from Batman, would become president, who would it be? Oh, it would be Donald Trump, right? And I thought that was really poignant of him to make that observation, and I was spot on, to be honest. And I think that. On one hand, he's kind of a fool, Donald Trump is. Like, do we really have to take Donald Trump that seriously? I do think mainstream media and the left at times have overreacted to Donald Trump. I myself, I look back and I wonder what I have done. Yeah, we done a bunch of shows about fascism and the history of fascism on my program. And sometimes I sit and I wonder, did we overdo it? Were we overreacting to this? We did a lot of shows during the impeachment trials. Did we overdo this? Though I would defend doing the impeachment trials as, well, this is historically important. We should do it. But I still have to ask myself, and maybe sometimes I even overdid it at times as well. I'm open to, I think I have. I'll just say I think I have. But at the same time, Donald Trump may be a buffoon, but there's a certain danger that can still happen with a Donald Trump in power again. Like, maybe we're overreacting by talking about fascism when it comes to Donald Trump, or they're going to bring fascism and democracy is going to be over if Donald Trump gets elected again. There's a good chance we're overreacting, but there's also a bit of danger in there that it could actually still happen. And is it better to overreact to Donald Trump or underreact to Donald Trump? And I think that was a question, and I know you're not supposed to compare, and it's a bad comparison in many ways to Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini, the early figures of fascism. But everyone thought they were buffoons too, that you wouldn't take them very seriously. And so where do you want to err when it comes to someone like Donald Trump? Do you want to err by overreacting or underreacting? And I think I kind of would rather, what would I be more shamed of? I would be shamed of if I underreacted to the potential danger that there is with a Donald Trump. I do think there is that we are also mistaken by thinking that Donald Trump just comes from the void, comes from like, is it Godzilla coming from the sea, just out of it's just pure, evil. There's a reason why Donald Trump is popular and poses a threat, and that is the failing of the establishment itself. Um, but Donald Trump could potentially be even more dangerous, I
Yeah,
guess.
there's a problem that we might overdo it, but maybe we might underdo it
Yeah.
as well. Well, this is fascinating stuff. I wish we could go on, and I'm sure our viewers who are interested in this, they can go on and go to the KPFA archives and get all the archive shows of Letters in Politics, and you can find a lot of them on YouTube. And you can see all these questions explored at length in these fascinating interviews conducted by Mitch. So we could go on and on over a glass of tea, but we have to conclude. And thanks to Mitch Jeserich for an illuminating discussion. And goodbye until next time, when we will continue to ask the question, after we have tried everything else, why don't we try thinking about it?